I'm here at the University of Minnesota exploring the soul of Western civilization. The DNA of the Western civilization was written in the universities and monasteries in Europe. Now, the universities have rejected the ideas that created the modern West. Therefore, in a series of lectures, I'm exploring if the sun must now set on the West. Several years ago, I was invited to teach in Jinja in Uganda. And as I was flying to Uganda, I had somehow assumed that I was going to Africa, going to some desert. When I landed there, I realized how beautiful, lush green, much prettier than Minnesota, Uganda really is. And as I was being driven from the airport to the university campus, I saw hundreds of women and girls, children, carrying water on their head in yellow plastic containers. I felt perfectly at home because that's very typical of rural India where I had been living and serving. Except that next day when I woke up, I was told that I'm in fact in front of Lake Victoria, and I hadn't realized that Lake Victoria alone is bigger than all the 10,000 lakes in Minnesota. It's huge. It touches 3 nations. Moreover, I found out that in fact, I'm just 2 miles from the origin of the river Nile. Nile originates from Lake Victoria, which is this huge, hundreds of miles of water, and therefore, the Nile originates with tremendous force and velocity. And then I found out that the Nile begins with such force that in 1954, the British, who were ruling Uganda at that time, had built hydroelectric plants right at the source of Nile, and they were producing so much electricity that whole of Uganda was not able to consume that electricity. Some of it was sold to Kenya. So here I am with these hundreds of miles of fresh water, with enormous amount of electricity, and looking at these women and children carrying water on their heads. By second, third day, it didn't make sense. By fourth day, I began to feel that this was obscene, because carrying water, bringing water on your head to your home means that you don't have enough water in your home. That means you don't bathe enough, you don't wash enough, you don't wash your salads and your dishes and your fruit enough, and you are then infected with all kinds of germs. You have waterborne diseases in your stomach, and you're spending a lot of money and time in curing diseases which shouldn't be there, and you are working at a fraction of your energy. Besides, you're wasting millions of men are, at least women are, with carrying water, hauling water this way. So why are they doing it this way? Maybe they don't know about pumping technology, but actually from my window I could see a pump which was pumping water into an industrial complex. 2,000 Indians were living there and running the largest industrial complex outside of Jinja, and they were pumping water right out of Lake Victoria. So water is there, electricity is there, pumping technology is there. Why are then these people carrying water on their heads? This forced this question that why is it that some cultures do with their minds what other cultures do with their muscles? Now, this was the time when one movie was creating sensations in America, and that was Crouching Tigers, Hidden Dragons, or is it the other way around? I've forgotten. Now, the movie that I enjoyed, and my wife endured for my sake, but it's a great movie. Love the scenes of these characters flying from bamboo tops to bamboo tops, fighting with swords. They can fly, literally. Now, what was so interesting about it was the movie was demonstrating the power of the mind, the psychic power that one could obtain, through meditation and all kinds of spiritual disciplines and exercises which one learned in Chinese monasteries. And this was captivating audiences right here in America and throughout the world. But as I'm looking at this problem of these people pumping water into this industrial complex, I realize that the true magic of the mind is technology. When you use technology, then you are using the magic of the mind, because water is producing electricity and electricity is pumping water into your home. So when you use your mind, water brings itself to your home. That's technology, right? The water bringing itself to your home. And some cultures, particularly the Western culture, cultivated the mind through science and technology to have this real magic where two people can provide more water into everyone's home than a million women going morning and evening, 365 days a year, hauling water on their heads. The topic today is the setting sun. The West rejecting the soul of Western science and technology, the worldview, the force, the spirituality, the outlook that created this civilization, in favor of sorcery and magic and witchcraft and occult. Let me illustrate the point, which is true and recent story. One mother, her little 10, 11, 12-year-old boy, started complaining to her that his knees were hurting. Well, she seemed to pay attention to it, but didn't quite pay attention. She knew it would get all right in the morning, and it did. He was fine. He was playing around. Next evening, he complained they had hurting more than yesterday. And she said, okay. She looked at it, patted, comforted him, put him to bed. Morning, he was fine. Well, third day, they were hurting even more. And fourth day, the pain was terrible. So the mother's heart and mind kicked in, and she began to have the worst case scenarios of what might happen, all sorts of tests and treatments and wheelchair and future for this boy and future for the family, the implications of what might be happening. Except that next day when she woke up and was making her breakfast, she saw the boy climb up the hood of the car and leap up into the air, came down with a big thud, and then of course the knees hurt, and he got up looking at his knees and looked at the car and looked at the ground, and then climbed up the hood again and jumped again. And then the knees hurt more, and she could see through the window that he's hurting, but then he climbed up the hood again and jumped again. She immediately understood why the knees are hurting, but she didn't understand why he was doing it. So she went out and asked him, what are you doing? Don't you realize this is what is hurting your knees? So he said he's trying to fly. Use his psychic power. You remember Spider-Man 2, there was a point where he couldn't climb the walls and couldn't fly, and he fell when he attempted to. I'm sure the girls haven't seen that movie, but the boys might have. And then he realized that if he used his psychic power, his faith, his concentration, then he can. And he does it, and he succeeds. Now, that's what the boy was trying to do, to cultivate his psychic power to fly. And that's what was happening in the Crouching Tiger's Hidden Dragon, which is happening in the Spider-Man movie. The West is moving from science to sorcery. We were talking last Tuesday about Leonardo da Vinci. One of the machines he designed was a helicopter that four people could paddle. Now, back then, 500 years ago, it didn't work. We didn't have quite the technology, the light enough, hard enough alloys that could allow you to build that machine. But today, if a young boy really wanted to build such a helicopter which was driven by paddles, it can be done. You will just have to probably have a speedboat which gives you a lift as a paragliding or parasailing, and the gliding wings, and then the paddles that will give you a rotation, etc. It could be, if the father or parents were really interested, or uncles and aunts and grandparents, in supporting this boy's vision of flying, they could help him realize Leonardo's vision of creating a machine which four young boys could in fact use. But that's not how the culture is training him in using science and technology to do things, the magic of defying the law of gravity and actually flying. Well, I know the mother. She is doing a wonderful work with street children in California, so I don't mean any insult to the family. But I want to suggest that young boy is a sorcerer's apprentice. And the sorcerer is American culture, which is given up its heritage of science and technology in favor of this move towards occult, witchcraft, psychic power, to manipulate nature and control nature, to have personal power over nature. The boy is not alone. There are millions of young women who would like to be teenage witches, who would call themselves as witches and put their photos and profiles on the internet. There are any number of witches that meet right here in Minnesota who are university graduates, who are exhibiting this move, which is, I suggest, a worldview shift from science to sorcery. You can laugh at a 12-year, 11-year-old boy as naive, who cannot make a distinction between fantasy and fact, that he'll grow out of it. But the reality is that multinational companies and universities, including the University of Minnesota, at one stage at least, were patronizing transcendental meditation. And the only advantage that a grown-up university graduate had over this boy was that a university graduate professional who was working for Microsoft or IBM or Coca-Cola would not climb up a car to jump to try and fly, but he will sit and try and levitate, right? You saw the pictures of levitation. He will not try and make helicopter, but try and levitate. So this isn't about a silly young boy. This is a whole cultural shift where you try and cultivate your psychic powers to defy the law of gravity and law of nature, instead of living within those natural laws, understanding those laws, and using those natural laws to establish your dominion over nature, but moving in this totally different direction of cultivating your psychic power to try and develop what, obviously, I'm using the word sorcery to include the whole of the occult, the entire spectrum of the occult. I would love to get into the soul of science, of how the West actually became a scientific and technological civilization. That's where I'd really like to spend time. But to get the big picture clear first, so if you believe that God created this universe, this material universe is really out there, you are a finite creature who is made in God's image, and the Creator tells you you've been created to understand and know His creation and to establish your dominion over this creation. You are finite, you will always remain finite. You are not God, but you are like God. You can understand, you can rule over this nature. Then you have one particular attitude towards nature, which, as I will show, led to the development of science and technology in Western civilization. But on the other hand, if you rule God out, that there is no God, God doesn't exist, then you have to redefine what this universe is and what man is, and human relationship of a human being to nature. Now, you can go in many different directions. You can have a completely materialistic, secular, naturalistic idea that there is no spirit in the universe. There is no God. There are no spiritual beings. I don't have any spirit. I do have an idea that I have a self, which is eternal, abiding, at least as long as I live. But you can conceive that it is a cultural construct, a linguistic construct. It is an illusion. Self or spirit doesn't really exist, but somehow that's how life has evolved, that we feel that we are spirit beings, selves, souls. But of course, we have to get rid of this illusion, and it will come to an end automatically when we die anyway. But somehow that materialistic explanation of reality isn't satisfactory for a whole number of reasons, which we won't discuss right now. But in that case, since consciousness is real, as Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist and philosopher, who is really the father of the New Age movement in the West, as he said, the fact is that consciousness exists in little creatures, ants, and in animals, and mammals, and human beings. We can't deny the fact of consciousness. And if consciousness exists, it could not have come into existence later. It must have been there from the beginning. You know, he uses this example that if carbon and oxygen are interacting in an equation, you can get carbon monoxide, CO, or you can get carbon dioxide, CO2, or you can get CO3, but you can't get H2O. You can't get water because there is no hydrogen in the equation. So what is not there from the beginning cannot surface later on. If consciousness has surfaced, if hydrogen has appeared later on, then it must have been there in some form from the very beginning. That's his argument in The Phenomenon of Man. So from there he argues that since consciousness has appeared on this side of the equation, it must have been there from the very beginning. And if the consciousness has been there from the very beginning, then it is reasonable to assume that it is in fact consciousness which has been driving the entire process of evolution. And there is no reason to imagine that evolution has stopped with man. What is evolving? He argues that it is in fact consciousness which is evolving. Ants have little consciousness, and animals have, rats have little more, and mammals have a lot more consciousness, and human beings are self-conscious. But if evolution has not stopped, what will be the next step in evolution? It will be evolution towards superconsciousness, so cosmic consciousness. And of course, from there he builds his monism or pantheism, that everything is consciousness. You know, if there is no God, then universe alone exists. What is universe? What is the relationship of matter to mind, matter to consciousness? And what Teilhard is saying, and what the New Age started believing, which was perfectly sensible and logical, is that in fact, consciousness is at the beginning, the alpha point, and consciousness is the omega point, We have to evolve towards superconsciousness, and that is what that child was doing who was jumping from the car and hurting his knees. That's what Spider-Man is doing, and that's what Harry Potter is doing, trying to increase consciousness, as Shirley MacLaine would put it in one of her books, that body or matter is materialized thought. Now, how they get there is not very difficult to understand, but I don't want to take time into explaining how they get there. But you see the worldview shift. The universe is all that there is. Consciousness is universe, core of the universe, heart of the universe. Consciousness is in you. God is in you. Universe is God. You are part of the universe. You are God. You don't know that you are God. You need to realize that you are God. You need to evolve. So you need to meditate. You need to expand your consciousness. So your worldview moves you towards sorcery, towards occult, towards psychic power. Now, you can look at that boy and admire his faith, admire his ability to live by his faith. He believes that he can fly. He's willing to suffer for it, break his legs for it, right? You can admire his dedication. We had greatly dedicated men and women, particularly men, in this case, who sat in caves. The favorite phase was 144 years. That these ascetics will sit in the caves for, they claim, 144 years to acquire these psychic powers. That's what the hippies were excited about when they went. They got fed up with Western civilization and chanted, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civ got to go. So let's look for alternatives. And they came to the Himalayan caves, and there they found these holy men, ascetics, who were sitting, or claimed that they were sitting in these caves and meditating and having these tremendous supernatural experiences and power. So they were cultivating their minds. And I met one meditator who said to me, these Americans went to moon only recently. We had been going not just to moon, but to all the planets and galaxies for thousands of years. I said, well, that may be true. The only problem is that you never bring rocks back. So we don't know whether you actually got out of your body or whether your trips were happening inside your mind, in your imagination. Is this real? The fact is that we still need water in our homes, and your mental psychic power might materialize ashes or materialize gold or watches, as some of the gurus can, but it doesn't bring water to our home. Our women and children still have to go and haul it on their heads. And that's where you need this development of science and technology. So what I'm suggesting is that you have different worldviews, and science and technology are fruits of a particular worldview. In Greece, there wasn't science, but there was a lot of techniques, a lot of correct information, good guesswork, etc., etc. There was knowledge. When there were theories, they had no empirical basis. Where there were observations, those observations had no theories. What they did have was some observations which didn't include the supernatural, which is what makes Greek knowledge so interesting. But all of that froze after Aristotle. The Romans acquired Greek civilization, and what you would like to call science really went down. It didn't grow during the Roman phase. Islam acquired the Greek knowledge. It didn't grow into modern science. Modern science arose as a scientific revolution during the 16th and 17th century. And the primary reason why this modern science was able to grow in Europe in the 16th and 17th century was because in the Middle Ages, particularly during 13th and 14th century, European intellectuals, on the basis of the Bible, were able to affirm what was right in Aristotle and critique what was wrong. The Muslim intellectuals were not able to critique Aristotle because they didn't have an external point of reference with which to critique Aristotle. And the really important reason for the development of science was the ability of scholastic thinkers, William of Ockham, Jean Buridan in Paris, etc., for them to be able to critique Aristotle. Several illustrations. One point was that in Aristotle, logic was the means of knowing truth. Whatever is not logical cannot be true. One of the fundamental problems was God cannot create vacuum because that's illogical to create vacuum. Therefore, there is no vacuum. Therefore, there is matter up there in the sky. The planets are in matter. Therefore, planets can only move if they are gods, or if gods are pushing them, angels are pushing them. The scholastic thinkers, beginning with William Ockham in Oxford, have real problem with that on biblical grounds, the grounds of Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created heavens and the earth, which means God existed before the universe. If God existed before the universe, God is not bound by any logic, which is part of the physical universe. God is free. So the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, Genesis 1:1, was the doctrine of God's freedom. And the freedom of God implied empirical observation. That observation needs to be put above logic. What that means is, if God is free to do whatever he wants to do, then we cannot know the truth on the basis of logical intuition and conclusions. Logic cannot lead us to truth. Logic has to be submitted to observation. Observation leads us to truth. Because we have to go out and see what God has done. If he's free, he's not bound by any logic, because no logic exists before God exists. If God is free, you cannot arrive at truth through logic. You have to arrive at truth through observation. Now, this had profound implications. The Bishop of Paris called a conference in 1277 where they specifically denounced this Aristotelian idea which had come through Averroes and Avicenna to the Muslim intellectuals in Europe, that God cannot create vacuum. This was denounced as a heresy. God is free. That is very often used as a starting point of modern science, because that implied a whole shift in epistemology, that is logic on top or is empirical observation on top. Aristotle has said, if you drop two things, one is twice as heavy as the other, heavier will fall twice as faster than the lighter one. This is logical, therefore this has to be true. So the Muslim intellectuals were saying logic is true, Aristotle is true, if observation contradicts logic, then there is something wrong with the observation. It was not up until Galileo that anyone actually tested when you drop two things, same volume, but different weight. Do they fall at different speeds or at the same speed? If they fall at the same time, then you have to have a new theory of motion, which Galileo began, Newton completed. So this epistemology, biblical epistemology based on Genesis 1:1, enabled Europe to critique Aristotle and to change, put logic as subservient to observation. Your theory may be logical, that doesn't mean it's true. You have to go out and test it, observe it. So science didn't begin in Europe because of Aristotle. It began in Europe in reaction to Aristotle. What was right about Aristotle was his confidence in human reason, and that's what something which the Bible affirmed. So it had been affirmed by Augustine, it had been affirmed by Origen, Tertullian, the scholastics. So that's a modern myth, a modern secular myth, that European science came from Greece. European science arose in reaction to Greece. So William of Ockham, Martin Luther, they see Aristotle as their main enemy, the one who is keeping us, who is stifling us. And that's what had in fact stifled knowledge and science in Greece and stifled science in Islam. William of Ockham, who gives this devastating critique of Aristotelian logic, he was actually put in detention for 8 years by the bishop. Science couldn't develop until Aristotle was put down. Francis Bacon is very biblical and very Christian. Diderot and the encyclopedias are anti-Christian. But those, Voltaire, Diderot, etc., they have nothing to do with the rise of modern science. They weren't scientists. They were trying to hijack science. And they were trying to provide a secular, rationalistic foundation for science, which culminates in logical positivism in the beginning of the 20th century. So by the time you come to David Hume, the Enlightenment moves from Descartes to Hume, European intellectuals already knew that on the basis of pure reason, pure rationalism without revelation, science is impossible. In his critique of pure reason, what David Hume is arguing is that causation, cause and every effect has to have a cause, and uniformity in nature is something that cannot be proven logically or empirically. We are finite. We don't know the whole, everything in nature. There is no way for us to know if water will boil at 100 degrees everywhere in the universe. There's no way to test it. There's no way to prove it. So the nature is uniform everywhere is an assumption of science, but it has to be that an assumption. If you say that we are only going to believe what we can prove, then the principle of uniformity cannot be proven. Therefore, science is not possible. Causation cannot be proven, that every effect has to have a cause. Then you have to assume that the universe has to have a cause, God has to have a cause, and obviously something is uncaused. If something is uncaused, then how can you assume that everything has to have a cause? You can't prove causation. So Hume demolished the foundations of the Enlightenment, and that's where Thomas Reid from Scotland tried to save science on the basis of common sense. But Immanuel Kant succeeded in Germany by saying true objectivity is not possible. True empirical experience is not possible. When I see you seeing you simply means that I have an image in my brain. Is that image really caused by you out there? Or am I on drugs? Seeing things, and seeing pink elephant, a flying elephant, I see all sorts of things. Seeing simply means that I have sensations in my brain. Are they caused by something out there? We have no way of knowing that the data is coming from outside. So Kant tried to save science by saying that, yes, true objectivity is not possible. All the information, all the sensations that come to us are interpreted with the categories built into our consciousness. So whatever we see is in fact what we are interpreting, our brain is interpreting, and it may not be true. So I see a solid wall, but now I know that wall is not solid. My senses deceive me. So right at the beginning of the Enlightenment knew that science is not possible. Pure, objective, empirical science is not possible. But the secular mind tried, particularly by the time you come to Bertrand Russell and the logical positivists, they tried to have a secular, rationalistic science without revelation, that human mind can know and can know the truth. That was demolished in the 1960s by Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions. Pure objectivity is not possible. Impartial observation is not possible. Out of that came the New Age movement, where people like Fritjof Capra, the Tao of Physics, Marilyn Ferguson, the Aquarian conspiracy and all, the whole movement which rejected the modern science. They had realized that what people like the common sense movement with Thomas Reid, Immanuel Kant tried to do cannot be done. What the modernity, a modern age, the secular rationalists have tried to do cannot be done. Now, it is in fact still being done. Science is still being done. You have very strong departments of science here. But it is being done not because there are non-biblical foundations for it, but because it works. An objective science worked because the Christian mind had confidence that we can arrive at objective truth. Although it is true that I don't know if what I'm seeing or what I'm hearing or what I'm smelling is coming from outside, God tells me that He has created a world outside of me. So I do have information which is not originating from my mind, because God has written two books, the book of His words and the book of His works. So I can look at the book of His works when I go out and see the world outside. I don't have to imagine that I'm imagining this world. I can believe that it is really out there because God, the Creator, has told me that He created a world out there. So the Christians didn't have that problem which the New Age had. The Enlightenment tried to ground science without revelation in human reason, human experience alone. The Enlightenment knew way back the time of 17th century itself that this cannot be done. They kept doing it. It collapsed in the 1960s. And that's the reason now the West is turning from science to sorcery. That the Enlightenment thinking is collapsed. It has no foundations. As Dr. Schaeffer used to say, that the secular humanist has his feet firmly planted in midair. There was no ground. Now, we can be grateful for postmodern deconstructionist scholarship, which has, after 100 years of secular nonsense, modernist nonsense, it has begun to admit, and not in a complimentary way, but in order to condemn the fact that modern science is a cultural product of white European Christian male culture. That's what created the science and technology, European white Christian male culture. They are the ones who created science and technology. Science is not a common sense way of viewing the world, relating to the world. This is a very peculiar way of viewing the world and relating to the world, understanding the world, and establishing your dominion over the world. Now, these postmodern scholars are admitting that on the basis of sound scholarship, sound history, yes, science and technology is a product of biblical culture. The postmodern scholarship is churning out tons of evidence of that fact. But that the Bible and the biblical worldview has in fact been the soul of science, the soul of technological culture of Western civilization, but following, say, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, etc., particularly the environmental movement that has how science and technology are the cause of the destruction of the planet. The sun is setting over this civilization because the soul has been amputated. The Bible has been rejected. Let me just give one or two illustrations of how that is what postmodern scholarship is saying is in fact the truth. One of the books at the book table is a life of William Carey that my wife and I wrote. This was a series of unrelated lectures and papers that we gave to celebrate 200th year of his arrival in India, and it continues to be translated and used all over the world. Now, he was a British cobbler who became a linguist and came to India as a missionary to translate the Bible into Indian languages, establish the first college which became a university, private university in India, Serampur College, and he began teaching science. He personally taught astronomy and botany. So here is a cobbler, linguist, missionary who has come to evangelize India, but has become an educationist, is founded the Horticultural Society in Calcutta. If you go to the Horticultural Society, as you enter, it's his bust, a marble bust, which honors, if you look at the minutes of the society, they are all in his beautiful, neat handwriting. The interesting thing about this cobbler turned linguist turned missionary is that two of the plants if you look into the botanical library here in modern taxonomy, two of the plants are named after him because he was also a botanist. He had the second best botanical garden in his seminary, and which was washed away in the floods, but he also was collecting stones to understand stones in India, and his stone collection is still there. Now, so he went to India, never returned to Europe, but in India he would hear that there is a botanical conference happening in Brussels, in Belgium or wherever. So he would send the plants he has been studying. He is a Baptist missionary studying plants and defining all their characteristics and features and sending the information. And so the botanists are so impressed because no one else knows about these plants, and the plants are named after him. Why is he doing that? What's driving him? Modernists still, who are living in the 20th century, they say, oh, science and religion, they are incompatible. Just think, hasn't Darwin proven that the Bible is false and wrong? There is no relationship between Bible and science. The question that I'm raising is, why didn't China or India or Egypt produce a Darwin? Why was he born in England? And the answer is, no, Carey was in India 200 years ago. Darwin wrote 150 years ago. The Origin of Species was published in 1859. Carey was already dead in 1836. It was people like Carey, simple Christians, who were studying plants and animals, and they'd been doing it for 200 years before William Carey, and classifying them, creating this modern taxonomy. So someone like Darwin could look at, here is all the classification of plants, here is all the classification of animals. There are simple animals, more complex animals, human beings. This must have evolved from that. Darwin's theory became possible because there had been this 400 or 350 years of accumulation of this database and classification. What was driving this cultural movement to study nature? The primary force that was driving it was that by the time of the Reformation in the 16th century, now the Protestant movement didn't create science. Most of the fundamental work for the birth of modern science had in fact been done by Catholic scholarship. But the Protestant movement brought certain significant factors into the mix, and one of them was to begin to read the Bible literally, take the Bible seriously at its face value. This was something new because ever since Plato, in Europe, the most influential hermeneutics was allegorical hermeneutics. Plato is writing in the Republic that we need to create utopia, perfect society, which means we have to educate our young people. How do we educate our young people? Well, we have only our religious epics to teach them, but our gods and goddesses in these epics are very dirty. So we have to sanitize or allegorize our epics. So an allegorical method of interpretation of scriptures developed in Greece. It was brought into the Jewish mindset through Philo of Alexandria, who also saved the concept of logos and brought it into the Christian tradition. He not only brought the idea of logos, but the idea of allegorical method, which affected people like Origen, Augustine, and the church fathers. So during the Middle Ages, as people are looking at ants, they're looking at ants as what are the moral lessons that I can learn of diligence and organization and working in summer, saving up for winter and rains. Then ants have something to teach us. They're not creatures that you are studying for their own sake. But by the time of the Reformation, the conflict between the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Church was that where is the final authority? And the Reformers said that the final authority is in the Bible, the scriptures. It is the Word of God. They have the final authority. Then you have to read it at face value, literally. What is it saying? Once you begin to read the Bible literally at face value, then it begins to change your understanding of spirituality and salvation. So in the Middle Ages, very often salvation is psychological, spiritual. So the story of Adam and Eve and the fall, etc., are allegorical stories. They are great moral lessons, but they're not history. That didn't actually happen, or at least we don't have to take them historically. But once you begin to take them historically, then you realize that life is not suffering. Life was not intended to be suffering. Life was blessing. Eden means bliss. God wanted bliss for Adam and Eve. Curse came, thorns and thistles came, suffering and death came as a result of sin. God's desire is bliss. An earthly paradise was what God had desired for Adam and Eve to live forever in an earthly paradise, having fellowship with God. Adam and Eve were commanded to establish their dominion over this creation. God had created one garden but he said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, turn the whole earth into a garden. God was giving them knowledge and information. Adam was the first zoologist who had classified all the animals. Now, all of that knowledge has been lost because that language was lost in which Adam classified the animals. Now, if we want salvation, if we have been redeemed, and if we want to reestablish our dominion over this earth, then we have to restart the project that Adam was given. To look at all the plants, look at all the animals, classify them, understand them, so that redemption is not simply to us, but the whole creation which is suffering, which is groaning, begins to share in the redemption and the glory. So for the glory of God, right now creation is not what it should be. These cyclones come, thunderstorms come, hurricanes come, famines come. They don't bring glory to God. But if we understand and reestablish our dominion, turn this into a garden, that's when we are really worshiping God, glorifying God. Heavens declare the glory of God. Therefore, heaven should be steadied. All things are created for the glory of God. Therefore, all things should be steadied. So, while William Carey is a cobbler, is a linguist, is a Bible translator, is a missionary, he's all studying plants and rocks and trees. Now, that's what is driving science. Technology obviously started much before science. Science began in the universities. Universities were not interested in technology until the 20th century. But technology began in Christian monasteries about in the 8th century. And I have, in 2002, the series of lectures that I gave, I had a whole lecture on technology, which is available outside on the book table. Why technology didn't grow in Buddhist monasteries or Hindu ashrams, but it grew in European monasteries. And the reason was that the story of the fall of man communicated that God is a worker, therefore to work is godliness. But since man has sinned, work has turned into toil. Work is godliness. Toil is a curse. Carrying water on your head morning and evening, 365 days, while your husband is sitting and playing cards, is slavery. The wife is doing it because she's too weak to say that, look, you playing cards, you go and get water, I want to read Good Housekeeping. She's too weak to say that. She's a slave. This is toil, mindless work which natural forces can do. So the mentality that grew was, this is dehumanizing. What can be done by wind and water and sun and horse and oxen shouldn't have to be done by human beings. Toil is a consequence of sin. Deliverance from sin has to mean deliverance from the curse of sin, including the curse of toil. Therefore, a technology developed which liberated. American women don't have to go out and bring water on their heads because this culture was built on the Bible. It emancipated, it liberated from the drudgery of toil, which was seen as a result of the curse, not what God's desire, as slavery. The West advanced beyond other cultures, particularly through science and technology, because the Western civilization was driven by the biblical worldview. That was the force that created the West. If Now the West is moving where Africa was, or South America is, and India was. Some of the primitive cultures have been in the area of sorcery and occult and black magic and witchcraft. It's because the West has amputated its soul, turned away from the Bible, and is accepting the very outlooks, worldviews, philosophies that kept our people and our cultures in slavery, in bondage. Sorcery, witchcraft, occult, wizardry are part of C.S. Lewis, are part of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien. But their worldview is very Christian. The Hobbit is facing supernatural evil, is facing sorcerers and witches, but he is not learning sorcery. His weapon is obedience to his call, self-sacrifice, loyalty to his friends, faithfulness, suffering. His virtue is a Christian. Supernatural help comes to save him from supernatural evil, but he is at no point encouraged to learn sorcery, to fight sorcery. Harry Potter, on the other hand, is learning sorcery to fight sorcery. Though J.K. Rowling is also bringing some virtues to him, which are fairly biblical virtues. So in critiquing Harry Potter or Spider-Man, I'm not critiquing fantasy. Fantasy is a genre of literature which is Christian. It really begins with John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, imaginative allegory, and climaxes in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. The problem is not with fantasy, and problem is not with reading Harry Potter. You know, prophet Daniel went to the same school as Harry Potter, and in fact became the president of that school. He is confronting astrologers and sorcerers and magicians, but he isn't practicing any of that. He's practicing faith and obedience and suffering, self-sacrifice, prayer for rebuilding of his nation, for overcoming tremendous historical evil. And so we have to separate a legitimate use of fantasy, which is what Lord of the Rings is, with illegitimate use, which is confusion of what is real, what is the kind of power that a believer should be seeking. I was surfing the net yesterday, and I found that you can now pay $275 and get a sorcerer to cast spells on whoever is casting eyes on your wife, or the girl that you want to have, but she's not interested in you, she's interested in someone else. So you can now, in Minnesota, get witches and sorcerers and magicians who will do exactly here what we have back there. You know, as you go into New Delhi and begin to drive from New Delhi to your home, you see trucks and auto rickshaws and tempos with all sorts of things written at the back. They are spells, with shoes upside down, with chili and lemon hanging. Those are all magical spells because everybody is casting evil eye on your property, on your house, on your child, on newborn baby. You have to protect yourself, so you have to hire magicians and astrologers. You feel that you're in a world full of this evil, because it's not a culture which is built on an absolute love your neighbor as yourself. Do not covet your neighbor's property. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. When you don't have those absolutes, that's what everybody is doing, coveting neighbor's property, house, wife, daughter. And then you have the responsibility of protecting yourself. So you have a whole culture full of sorcery and witchcraft and occult. And I just hope that you're not the last generation in America to have this feeling of being insulated. The high school kids now may not be insulated. To deny that the command to love your neighbor as yourself is an absolute command, and not covet your neighbor's wife and your neighbor's property is an absolute, that these are relative, they can be dispensed with. When you really want her and she wants you, it's okay. And for the American courts and legal system to say that we don't recognize adultery and this is all fine. You're creating a mess for your children. So that's the whole point of the setting sun. Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, is a good example of a rationalist, secular interpretation of the West, that West became this awesome power because of guns and steel. That kind of an explanation doesn't really explain anything. The question is, Europe was using wooden plows when Chinese were using iron. The Chinese continued to use iron when Europe graduated to steel. Where did that dynamism, metallurgy, etc., come from? The gunpowder was discovered by the Chinese, but they never used it for anything other than firecrackers. Europe developed guns within a few decades of getting the gunpowder. Where did that spirit of science and technology come from? This is the question. Technology develops when you have people who use the mind also use their muscle, who work. Buddhist monks, Christian monks had the same problem. They didn't have wives. Who grinds your flour and who makes your bread? Buddha asked his disciples to go and beg, so they'll come to your wife. Paul said, the New Testament said that whoever doesn't work shouldn't eat. Christian monks had to work, but they also had to study because they were there to know God, to know the world, to establish their dominion. So here was a group of people who saw work as godliness, toil as a curse. I shouldn't have to do what water can do, what wind can do, what sun can do, what an ox can do. Let's use these powers, let's establish our dominion, not just for ourselves, but to deliver us from the curse of sin, the consequences of sin. So the quest for technology was one of the greatest forces for humanization, for emancipation. 50 to 60% of Indian women today, in the 21st century, spend 1 or 2 hours a day collecting cow dung to make cow dung cakes for fuel. They cook on them, burn their lungs. By the time they're 50, they're as weak as a 90-year-old American woman because they've been inhaling these poisonous gases. It's not because Indians lack genius or ability, but they're victims of our belief system, of our worldview. Now, technology has always been there because it's part of who we are as human beings. Buddhist monks were just as capable as Christian monks, but the Buddhist monks were making marvelous caves and marvelous statues, not water mills and windmills, which emancipate human beings. So technology was always there, but it was used for prestige, for power, for fame, for pleasure, for torture, for war. It wasn't used for human emancipation. The momentum for technology is already there in the West, and it will continue. But as the worldview changes, technology now will be used for video games, for virtual sex, not for human emancipation. So technology will become dehumanizing because the understanding of humanity has been lost. The worldview has been lost. So technology was there in India. India built Taj Mahal. Whole of America, economic superpower, doesn't have any building which compares to Taj Mahal. And that was built 400 years ago. The problem is that the cultures that built pyramids and Taj Mahal didn't make wheelbarrows for their slaves, for their women. They cared for their glory. They didn't care for the people. So you can have technology for prestige, glory, war, pleasure, but you miss the whole point. It's no longer helping free human beings from the curse of sin. So the loss of the biblical worldview will have profound implications for the whole culture, and that's something which we'll continue to explore in this series. Thank you. These lively interactions with students, faculty, and community at the University of Minnesota have reinforced my faith that there is no reason for the West to amputate its own soul. A recovery of faith is possible and desirable. The sun need not set on the West.